When the Roman Empire stood on the edge of oblivion, one warrior carried its fate in his hands. Across deserts, seas, and shattered kingdoms, he fought not for glory, but for the survival of a civilization. This is the story of the last great Roman general. In the 6th century, when the Roman Empire existed only as a fading shadow of its former glory, history prepared one final test. A test that demanded a leader with more than strategy, more than courage. It demanded a man willing to stand against the tide of time itself. The empire was fractured, its borders collapsing, its enemies rising in every direction. The dream of Rome, once unstoppable, seemed destined to vanish into memory. And yet, from its weakened heart emerged a figure who refused to accept the death of a civilization. He entered a world where emperors feared betrayal more than enemy swords, where generals rose only to be consumed by politics, where loyalty was a currency more rare than gold. But he carried something few possessed: a quiet brilliance, a discipline forged in hardship, and a dedication to Rome that did not depend on reward or recognition. In his hands, warfare became art precise, fluid, devastating. The eastern frontier burned with Persian fire, the deserts echoing with the clash of empires. While others faltered, he stood firm, using strategy instead of sheer force, turning impossible odds into triumphs that stunned both allies and enemies. His victories were not loud, they were elegant, achieved with fewer men, fewer resources, yet producing results that echoed across continents. But his journey did not end at the gates of Persia. Across the Mediterranean, forgotten provinces waited under the rule of foreign powers: the Vandals in Africa, the Goths in Italy. The dream of reclaiming the old Western lands seemed like fantasy, and yet he sailed, not as a conqueror, but as a guardian of Rome's last hope. With discipline and vision, he toppled kingdoms thought invincible, restoring lands that had been lost for generations. Yet his greatest battle was not fought on open fields, but in the shadows of his own empire. Triumph brought jealousy. Loyalty was met with suspicion. The closer he came to reviving Rome, the more those in power feared the strength of the man who made it possible. His life became a delicate balance between duty and danger. A soldier fighting not only enemies, but the very system he fought to protect. Through victories, betrayals, and impossible missions, one question began to rise. Could a single man carry the legacy of Rome on his shoulders, or was he destined to be remembered as the last spark of a world already fading? This is the story of a general whose greatness was matched only by his loyalty, a warrior who fought to restore an empire that could never fully recognize the price he paid. When an empire stands on the brink of extinction, history does not search for the privileged or the powerful. It searches for the willing. And in a world where Rome existed only as a trembling echo of its former greatness, the call for salvation did not come from marble halls or golden thrones. It rose from the dust of battlefields, carried by the footsteps of a soldier shaped by hardship, clarity, and an unshakable loyalty to a dying legacy. The empire he served was no longer the Rome of emperors who commanded continents. It was a fragile remnant, held together by ambition, fear, and the memory of past glory. From the great cities of the East to the forgotten provinces of the West, the once mighty realm struggled to breathe. Its borders cracked, its armies bled, its people prayed for a leader who could make the impossible feel inevitable again. And in the midst of this despair, a quiet force began to rise, unrecognized at first, then undeniable. He was not a man of lavish origin or inherited power. No destiny was carved for him in stone. What set him apart was not birthright, but a relentless discipline that ran through every action, every breath, every thought. He understood suffering, scarcity, and the cold reality of war long before he commanded armies. He knew what it meant to fight for survival, not ambition. And because of that, he learned how to lead men who sought not victory for glory, but victory for life itself. The Empire needed such a man, though it did not yet know it. As a young soldier, he observed more than he spoke. He watched commanders make reckless decisions driven by pride. He watched poorly planned assaults end in unnecessary bloodshed. He watched cities fall because arrogance drowned caution. And as he watched, he learned. He cataloged every failure, every miscalculation, every flaw in the designs of those who claimed to protect Rome. Not to criticize, but to prepare. Leadership, he understood early, was not granted. It was earned through wisdom, forged in patience, and tested in fire. War, to him, was not chaos. It was a language. Every formation, every retreat, every clash of steel carried meaning. He studied enemy patterns with a clarity most could not comprehend. Where others saw danger, he saw opportunity. Where others feared the size of an opposing force, he calculated angles, terrain, timing. His mind worked like a strategist centuries ahead of his time, weaving tactics into something that resembled art. Precise, fearless, and astonishingly effective. Yet his brilliance remained hidden for years, buried under ranks he had not yet been permitted to surpass. The Empire was slow to recognize talent. Politics overshadowed merit, suspicion overshadowed vision. But even in obscurity, he shaped men around him. Soldiers began to notice his uncanny ability to read the battlefield. They saw how often his predictions came true. They witnessed how he could calm the storm of fear with only a single command spoken with reason and confidence. They followed him not because they were ordered to, but because instinct told them that survival followed wherever he led. The Empire's enemies, meanwhile, grew bolder. To the east, a relentless Persian force threatened the borders, testing Rome's weakening strength. To the north and west, tribes and kingdoms once frightened by the might of the legions now felt bold enough to challenge them openly. And within the Empire itself, corruption eroded loyalty, while ambition blinded the powerful. That was when fate intervened. A conflict erupted on the eastern frontier, a clash so fierce it demanded a leader who could think beyond tradition, beyond routine, beyond fear. Commanders hesitated, unsure who could lead the exhausted, undermanned Roman forces against an enemy renowned for its power and ferocity. Yet in the corridors of uncertainty, one name began to surface, not with thunder, but with quiet insistence, like a truth the world had long ignored. His opportunity arrived, not with fanfare, but with urgency. He was thrust into a position where a failure would not only cost battles, but perhaps the Empire itself. Most saw the appointment as desperate, reckless Evan, but he accepted not with pride, but with calm determination. The weight of Rome did not intimidate him. It reminded him of the reality he had lived through his entire life. Nothing worth preserving survives without sacrifice. When he took command, the army he inherited was broken. Soldiers were weary, resources scarce. Morale nearly extinguished. The enemy, confident and organized, pressed forward with growing intensity. No commander before him had turned such conditions into victory. Yet he stood before his men with a quiet fire that rekindled something long forgotten. His speeches were not grand. They did not mimic the rhetoric of ancient conquerors. Instead, they were simple, honest, and grounded in the truth every soldier knew. Battles were won by clarity, unity, and trust. He spoke of strategy rather than glory. He explained not only what they would do, but why. In his presence, confusion dissolved. Panic faded. Men straightened their armor and strengthened their grip on their shields, not because they believed the enemy was weaker, but because they believed he would not lead them into death without reason. When the first clash came, the result stunned both friend and foe. His movements were swift and fluid. He predicted the enemy's plans with near-perfect accuracy. He used terrain to his advantage, turning fields of disadvantage into grounds of victory. And when the enemy tried to overwhelm with numbers, he responded with intelligence, striking fast, retreating strategically, and returning with devastating precision. His genius was confirmed, his legend had begun, and Rome, for a brief, shining moment, had found its last champion. Join us next time as we follow this general into the heart of battle. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe for more. Under his command, soldiers began to fight differently. Where there had been doubt, there was now confidence. Where there had been fear, there was now purpose. Victories that should have been impossible became realities. The eastern frontier, once thought doomed, began to stabilize. Word of these triumphs traveled fast, whispers reaching the capital, raising eyebrows, stirring attention. But success came at a price. The higher his victories lifted him, the more closely powerful eyes watched. Suspicion began to follow his name. Praise mixed with jealousy, admiration intertwined with fear. To restore Rome's fading strength with such brilliance was to challenge the fragility of those who claimed to control it. Yet he remained unmoved, concerned not with court politics, but with the survival of the empire he served. His loyalty was absolute. His purpose, unwavering. As campaigns continued, he demonstrated an ability few generals possessed. Restraint. He did not slaughter for glory. He did not destroy for pride. Even in victory, he sought peace, stability, and order, qualities desperately needed in a world drowning in chaos. His conduct earned him respect across cultures. Enemies who faced him on the battlefield often spoke of him with admiration, acknowledging a commander who fought with honor in an age where honor had all but faded. His men revered him. The populace saw hope in him. Even foreign rulers recognized the rare blend of intelligence and virtue he carried. But within the empire, such greatness was a double-edged sword. Whispers began to rise in the imperial palace. Questions formed in the minds of those whose trust was fragile. Could a general with such brilliance remain loyal? Could a man with such influence resist ambition? Could a warrior capable of reviving Rome's strength choose service over power? He gave them the answer time and time again by choosing duty above all else. As his reputation grew, so did the challenges placed before him. Missions deemed impossible were entrusted to him, some perhaps with the hope he would fail. Yet each new assignment he accepted with the same calm resolve, and each time he returned with results that defied expectation. His rise from ordinary soldier to indispensable protector of the empire was not the story of chance. It was the result of mastery earned through trial, patience, and unwavering commitment. He became the embodiment of Rome's last great hope, the final spark capable of igniting the dying flame of a once unstoppable empire. He stood at the junction between the world Rome had once dominated and the world threatening to erase it. And in that fragile space he became something few in history ever achieved. Not just a general, but a guardian of a civilization's memory, fighting, not for future empires, but to preserve one that had given the world its laws, its roads, its culture, its identity. His journey as a commander was not simply a rise, it was a defiance of fate itself, a refusal to let an empire built over centuries crumble without resistance, a promise that the Roman spirit, however battered, would not vanish quietly. And so, as the empire trembled and the world watched, he became a shield against the darkness pressing in from all sides, a final reminder that even in the last hours of a fading age, greatness can still emerge. And yet the world did not grant even a moment's pause to the empire as a fragile resurgenze. No sooner had the eastern frontier steadied than new fires ignited across the horizon, fires that threatened not only borders, but the very idea of Rome itself. Kingdoms once subdued by imperial might now rose with renewed ferocity. Old enemies tested the weakened empire with daring raids, while new powers emerged with ambitions sharpened by centuries of watching Roman strength fade. The Mediterranean, once called our sea, had become a mosaic of rival dominions, And in the midst of this shifting landscape, he stepped into a role far greater than that of a mere commander. He became the strategist upon whom the fate of continents now quietly depended. The first great storm gathered in the deserts and mountains of the east, where the Persian Empire pushed relentlessly against Roman territories. Their armies were disciplined, formidable, and confident. They believed the Romans too fractured, too distracted, too diminished, to defend what little remained of their once vast frontier. Time and again, they launched offensives, meant not merely to conquer land, but to crush the spirit of their ancient rival. Cities were isolated, trade routes severed, and fortresses pressed to their limits. But where the Persian saw weakness, he saw patterns stymieing, supply lines, terrain, and the subtle mistakes buried in their strategy. He studied these patterns with the same meticulous focus he had shown in earlier campaigns, using every scrap of intelligence to craft responses that never relied on brute force. His strength lay not in overwhelming numbers, but in outthinking enemies who believed themselves untouchable. When they advanced expecting resistance, he offered silence retreating only to draw them deeper into lands that favored him. When they anticipated ambush, he struck on open ground. When they braced for direct assaults, he feigned weakness, then shattered their formations with precision they could not anticipate. These conflicts were not battles alone. They were chess matches, where each move carried the weight of survival, and slowly, the Persians realized they faced not the fractured weakness of the empire they had expected, but something far more unsettling, an enemy who understood them better than they understood themselves. Victory after victory along the frontier restored more than territory. It restored the belief that Rome could still defend itself. Soldiers who had once resigned themselves to defeat now marched with renewed purpose. Civilians who had grown accustomed to invasions began to rebuild with hope rather than desperation. His presence turned panic into order, confusion into discipline, and fear into confidence. The frontier did not merely survive, it stabilized in a way the empire had not seen in generations. Yet even as the eastern threat receded, new demands arose from the heart of the empire. The emperor, driven by a dream larger than defense, sought to reclaim lands the Western Empire had lost long ago. Provinces such as North Africa and Italy, once pillars of Roman strength, now lay in the hands of foreign kingdoms. Their rulers believed the Romans too weakened to reclaim what had been theirs. But the emperors saw an opportunity in their arrogance, and so a plan took shape. The reconquest of the old Western territories, a campaign that would stretch across oceans, deserts, and ruined cities. But such a campaign demanded a commander capable of impossible achievements, a commander who could unite scattered forces, inspire loyalty across cultures, and wage war with limited resources against enemies entrenched for decades. When discussions began about who could lead such an endeavor, there was hesitation in the palace, not because he lacked ability, but because his rising influence cast long shadows among those jealous of his growing reputation. Yet the emperor knew the truth: no other leader could accomplish what was being envisioned. The mission required precision, restraint, and an iron will. And so the order was given. His next journey began not in familiar lands, but across the Mediterranean, sailing toward a kingdom whose rulers had grown complacent in their stolen power. The Vandal kingdom of North Africa had once been a formidable enemy, but now it rested on outdated confidence and internal division. Still, underestimating them would have been a deadly mistake. They were skilled horsemen, fierce fighters, and knowledgeable of the harsh terrain that stretched across their lands. The fleet he commanded was modest, far smaller than what such a mission should have required, but he understood that victory was not determined by numbers. It was determined by clarity, preparation, and the ability to adapt faster than the enemy. As the ships approached the African coast, he briefed his men not with bravado, but with precision. Every maneuver was planned, every response anticipated. He knew the Vandals expected a frontal assault, so he refused to follow their script. The landing was swift and executed with such stealth that enemy scouts barely recognized what had occurred until Roman banners rose where they least expected. What followed was a campaign of stunning speed. He turned the Vandal king's strengths against him, exploiting arrogance, disunity, and complacency. Battles that should have dragged on for months ended in days. Cities surrendered without resistance, their citizens astonished by the discipline and restraint with which the Roman forces conducted themselves. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this journey into the past, remember to like and subscribe for more stories from history. And when the Vandal king attempted one desperate final stand, he met a commander who anticipated every movement, every tactic, every retreat. The clash shattered the kingdom completely. North Africa, a province once considered lost forever, returned to Roman rule with astonishing efficiency. The victory echoed across the world, a reminder that the empire, though battered, was far from dead. But as soon as one triumph concluded, another challenge rose, larger and more daunting. The emperor now turned his eyes toward Italy, the ancient heart of Roman civilization. For the Goths, it had been ruled by the Ostrogoths, powerful people who demanded respect, not through cruelty, but through strength. They had stabilized Italy after the collapse of the Western Empire, and their rule was not one easily overturned. To reclaim these lands would require more than military genius. It would require navigating politics, culture, and the loyalties of a population torn between memory and survival. The journey into Italy began with both confidence and dread. Unlike Africa, Italy was not a kingdom crumbling under its own weight. It was united, fortified, and prepared. The Goths were warriors, trained from youth to endure hardship and battle. Their generals were capable, their armies vast, and their knowledge of the land unparalleled. To face them with limited forces was a gamble few commanders would dare accept. Yet he understood something others did not. Italy was not a land to be conquered by force alone. It was a land to be liberated through strategy, patience, and the careful management of alliances. He entered not as a destroyer, but as a restorer of Roman rule. Every city taken was treated with protection, not plunder. Every population spared became an ally, not an obstacle. This approach slowly eroded the Gothic grip on the peninsula. The battles that followed were some of the most grueling of his life. The siege of cities that stood for centuries became tests of endurance. Every fortress taken required sacrifices. Every mountain pass crossed demanded cunning. The Gothic army fought fiercely, refusing to yield easily. Yet he remained relentless. When outnumbered, he adapted. When surrounded, he maneuvered. When supplies dwindled, he stretched resources with an ingenuity that baffled his enemies. Cities opened their gates to him not because they feared his army, but because they trusted his purpose. Stories spread of a commander who punished looters, protected civilians, and honored agreements. These qualities were rare in a world accustomed to conquest through brutality. And slowly, Italy began to shift not only through military might, but through the quiet power of respect. Yet the deeper he pushed into Italy, the more complex the war became. The Goths, recognizing the threat he posed, rallied with renewed strength. Siege followed siege, winter after winter. Despite impossible odds, April said on, every victory came at a cost, yet each loss only fueled his determination. He fought not just for the emperor, but for an ideal Rome that still deserved to shape the world. His campaigns reshaped the map of the Mediterranean. They reawakened the memory of an empire that had once ruled unchallenged. And through these wars, he proved again and again that brilliance could triumph over adversity, that discipline could overcome chaos, and that the Roman spirit, though battered, could still rise. The Wars of Justinian, Persian struggles, the Vandal War, the Gothic War became the arena where he displayed not only military mastery, but the depth of his loyalty, resolve, and humanity. These conflicts forged him into the embodiment of the empire's last great surge of power, but they also exposed him to dangers greater than enemy blades' dangers, born of politics, fear, and suspicion within the very walls he fought to protect. Still, Through every trial, he advanced, carrying the weight of a fading civilization on shoulders strong enough to defy the collapse of an age. But even as those victories reverberated across continents, new storms were already forming, storms born not beyond the frontiers, but within the empire itself. Quiet whispers in palace corridors grew into currents strong enough to erode trust. Those who had once celebrated each triumph now spoke with unease, fearful that the glory earned on distant battlefields might overshadow the authority of those who ruled from marble halls. Jealousy, that old and silent enemy, began to sharpen itself behind closed doors, and while armies marched in his name, shadows moved against him in places where swords held no power. He learned of these whispers slowly, not through spies or informants, but through the subtle shift in how orders arrived from the capital. Where directives were once clear, they became tangled with contradictions. Where supplies were once abundant, they grew scarce at precisely the moments they were needed most. The emperor still trusted him, a vet. He had no doubt but influence is a fragile thing, and those who lived in fear of losing it worked tirelessly to cloud the emperor's mind. Yet he said nothing. Instead, he continued his work with the same discipline he had shown from the beginning. The empire, battered and divided, needed more than a victorious commander. It needed stability, vision, and a steady hand. And so he gave himself to the task, even as the weight of suspicion pressed heavily on his shoulders. The challenges within Italy had not yet ended when new demands came. Rebellions ignited in territories recently reclaimed, fueled by power-hungry nobles who saw opportunity in the chaos. Some claimed they fought for independence, others for justice, and still others for revenge. But beneath every rebellion lay the same truth. The empire's resurgence had disrupted too many ambitions, and wherever ambition is threatened, resistance follows. He faced these uprisings, not with the fury of a conqueror, but with the patience of a surgeon. When a town resisted, he sought out the cause, rather than simply crushing the symptoms. When a noble rebelled, he offered terms before punishment. When civilians suffered, he arranged relief before demanding loyalty. His approach disarmed many uprisings without a single drawn blade. But not all conflicts could be resolved with diplomacy. In some regions, warlords had carved out small kingdoms, sustained by violence and fortified by desperation. These men, drunk on newfound power, mistook Roman restraint for weakness, and so he dismantled them one by one with such tactical precision that even their surviving soldiers spoke of him with reluctant awe. He moved like a storm silent in approach, overwhelming in execution, and gone before the enemy fully understood what had struck them. Yet the deeper he ventured into these campaigns, the more isolated he became. Political factions in the capital now saw him as a threat, not because he sought power, but because his successes revealed their own failures. The more he accomplished, the more they whispered, and the more they whispered, the more the emperor hesitated. There were moments small at first, then unmistakable when his instructions were curtailed, his authority questioned, and his loyalty quietly doubted. Still, he remained steadfast. The empire, not his reputation, remained his purpose. But even the most loyal heart cannot remain untouched by betrayal. When the plague descended upon the empire, fear consumed every corner of society. Streets emptied, temples overflowed with desperate prayers, and bodhies filled the fields outside the city walls. Armies were crippled, supply chains shattered, and entire provinces fell into chaos. He watched as soldiers he had led for years succumbed one by one, reduced not by enemy blades, but by an invisible force that cared nothing for courage or strength. In the midst of this devastation, he continued to lead as best he could. He arranged quarantines, established supply routes, and protected cities from opportunistic enemies who sought to exploit the empire's weakness. Even when his own household fell ill, he refused to abandon his responsibilities. But the plague left scars, deeper than the dead it claimed. It weakened the empire so severely that many began to wonder whether any recovery was still possible. And as always, where fear grows, suspicion follows. His political enemies seized the devastation as an opportunity. They argued that his campaigns had overextended the empire, drained resources, and provoked rebellion. They painted his victories as threats to the emperor's authority rather than achievements for the empire's survival. With carefully crafted words, they portrayed him not as a servant of Rome, but as a rising star dangerous enough to eclipse the throne itself. Thanks for watching, and remember to subscribe for more stories from the pages of history. The shift was like a cold wind blowing through the halls of power. Invitations to the palace, once frequent, became rare. Messages from the emperor grew shorter, more formal, more distant. The very same officials who had once eagerly sought his counsel now averted their eyes. Whispering in corridors, he was no longer welcome in, and despite everything he had sacrificed, despite the blood, the sweat, and the years he had given to the empire, without ever once reaching for a crown, he found himself a target of the very government he had fought to preserve. Yet, even political isolation could not erase his influence with the people. In marketplaces, taverns, and forums, stories of his leadership spread like wildfire. Some exaggerated his feats, others recounted them with quiet reverence, but everyone agreed on one thing. He was the empire's shield, the man who had stood between civilization and its collapse. In the eyes of his jealous rivals, the public admiration was a dangerous fire that needed to be extinguished. To diminish his growing legend, the palace assigned him to minor duties, far from the center of power tasks, laughably unworthy of his skill. They hoped that obscurity would silence his legacy, that the people would forget. But they severely underestimated the resolve that had carried him through countless wars. Even in these small, forgotten assignments, he worked with the same ferocious intensity he had brought to the grandest campaigns. Whether he was securing a remote frontier, negotiating a fragile peace in a troubled province, or managing resources in a distant, dusty region, he performed with an excellence that could not be ignored. People followed him not because of his rank, but because they trusted his character. Soldiers who had once served under his command traveled immense distances just to stand at his side again. Civilians petitioned for him to take command of their regions, believing his presence alone could bring peace. His authority, it became clear, came not from the emperor's decree, but from the unwavering loyalty of the empire itself. But loyalty is a double-edged blade. The more the people believed in him, the more the palace feared him. Accusations were crafted with surgical precision, not designed to destroy him outright, but to slowly erode trust, to plant seeds of doubt in the emperor's mind. They accused him of harboring secret ambitions, of withholding critical information about rebellions, of forming alliances beyond imperial oversight. None of it was true, but in the halls of power, truth often matters less than the persuasion of fear. The emperor, torn between years of loyalty and a growing anxiety, wavered. He did not condemn his greatest general, but neither did he defend him. And so, the general served in a state of agonizing uncertainty, balancing on a knife's edge between honor and dismissal. Throughout this period, he remained outwardly calm, a mask of stoic dignity. He never confronted his accusers, never argued his innocence, never begged to reclaim lost favor. Instead, he simply continued working for the empire with a grace that silenced even some of his harshest critics. But inside, the weight of betrayal pressed down on him, a wound far deeper than any he had ever suffered on the battlefield. And then, the greatest test came. The fragile peace he had painstakingly built began to crack. In regions where victory had once been hard-won, new threats emerged like weeds in an untended garden. Foreign invaders, sensing weakness, tested the empire's borders once more. Tribal coalitions massed along the frontiers, and opportunistic warlords began carving out their own territories. The empire was bleeding, and the emperor needed a commander capable of stabilizing the chaos. Despite all the suspicion, all the fear, There was only one man with the experience, the authority, and the trust of the people to do it. Reluctantly, the palace summoned him. He returned to command not out of pride, but out of a profound sense of duty. The empire had called, and he could not refuse. But he understood something now that he had never allowed himself to consider before. The most dangerous battlefield was not in some foreign land, but right there, in the corrupt halls of politics. Steel could cut down an enemy, but words, whispered in the right ear, could destroy a life's work. He had already felt their sting. As he embarked on these new missions, he did so with the sharp clarity of a man who had seen both the best and the worst of the world he served. He led with greater patience, a sharper awareness of the political games being played, and a deeper understanding of the delicate balance between victory and vulnerability. His victories no longer brought him joy. They brought him caution. His successes no longer filled him with pride. They filled him with a quiet gratitude that the empire, his empire, still stood. And though he continued to command, to negotiate, to restore, and to protect, he realized that every step forward was shadowed by the knowledge that even the strongest loyalty could not shield him from envy. He had become more than a general. He had become a symbol of what the empire had once been, an era of discipline, courage, and unwavering honor. And symbols, no matter how necessary, are often feared by those who cannot live up to them. Still, he pressed on, carrying the immense weight of both admiration and suspicion, determined to serve the empire even as forces within it sought to erase him from history. In the end, what defines a life such as his is not the battles won or the titles earned, but the unwavering resolve with which he carried a fading world upon his shoulders. He stood firm through the storm of accusation, through the shifting tides of imperial favor, through plague, rebellion, and war. And even when the shadows gathered closest, he never allowed bitterness to stain his loyalty. He served not for reward, and not for glory, but for an ideal far older than any empire, an ideal of an empire that still lived in memory, in tradition, and in duty. His journey was shaped by victories that reshaped continents, by strategies still studied by military minds, generations later, and by a fierce devotion to order in a world that was splitting at its seams. Yet what truly sets his story apart is the quiet humanity behind the armor, the discipline that never hardened into cruelty, the authority that never became arrogance, the brilliance that never once sought a crown. He achieved what others believed impossible, not because he chased greatness, but because he refused to abandon his responsibility. As the years passed and his role eventually diminished, what he had built endured. Cities he had reclaimed from ruin, borders he had secured against invasion, enemies he had humbled, and hopes he had revived in the hearts of the people. Even when those in power sought to dim his legacy, the people kept it alive. The soldiers who had marched beneath his banners, the families who had been spared the horrors of war, the nations that had been reshaped by his campaigns. They spoke of a leader who fought, not for himself, but for the fragile remnants of an empire he still believed could stand. And so his name became something far greater than a title or a rank. It became a testament to the last spark of that empire's greatness, a final embodiment of the discipline, the vision, and the fortitude that had once transformed a small city into the heart of the ancient world. Through him, the empire glimpsed one last, fleeting moment of the glory it had nearly forgotten. His life reminds us that the end of an age is never just a collapse. It is also a mirror that reveals the last guardians who fought to hold the line. And among all who stood in those final, closing chapters, none carried the burden with more honor, more patience, or more unbroken loyalty than the man whose quiet brilliance became his civilization's last shield against the encroaching dark. Thanks for watching. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing for more tales of history's unsung heroes.